I transferred everything to my son on a quiet Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday, my bank account showed zero, not a single dollar left, just a cold empty number staring back at me like it knew something I didn't. But I didn't panic, not then. Because Daniel had looked me in the eyes just days before and said it was a smart investment, something safe, something that would grow, and I had nodded, trusting him the way a mother does when she believes she raised her child right, the way I believed. After 68 years of living and loving and losing that, I could still recognize honesty when I saw it, so instead of calling him, instead of asking questions, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the same kitchen table where I had signed the transfer papers, the sunlight coming through the blinds in thin quiet lines, everything looking exactly the same even though nothing was. I remember holding the mug in both hands just to keep them steady, not because I was afraid but because I was thinking, replaying every word, every pause, every glance between Daniel and Emily the night he first brought up the idea, how she had smiled just a little too quickly, how he had explained it just a little too smoothly, and I realized something then that settled deep in my chest like a truth I couldn't ignore. If everything was exactly as they said, there would be no reason for me to feel this silence, this strange stillness that had replaced what should have been excitement. So I didn't rush. I didn't accuse. I didn't even check my phone again. I simply sat there and let the quiet stretch, because sometimes the absence of noise tells you more than any explanation ever could. Later that evening Daniel called, his voice light, almost cheerful, asking if everything went through okay, and I told him yes, it was all done, and there was a pause, just a second too long, before he said good, that was good, and I could almost hear Emily in the background, not speaking but present, like she was waiting to hear my tone, to measure what I knew, and I gave them nothing, just the same calm voice I had always used, the same steady rhythm they had grown up with, because I wasn't going to show my hand, not yet. That night I checked my account one more time, still zero, still empty, and instead of fear, I felt something else take its place, something cooler, sharper. I realized I hadn't just given away my savings, I had given them an opportunity. And what they chose to do with it would tell me everything I needed to know. So I turned off the lights, went upstairs, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't pray for things to go back to how they were. I simply decided I would wait. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of what I had done, but because my mind kept returning to small details I had ignored before, the kind of details that never seem important until they suddenly are. Like the way Emily had started asking about my savings a few months back, always casually, always wrapped in concern, asking if I had enough for emergencies, if I had ever considered letting Daniel help manage things for me. And at the time I had thought it was kindness, the kind of attention families give each other as they grow older. But now, sitting alone in the quiet of my bedroom with the faint hum of the ceiling fan above me, those conversations felt different, heavier. Like pieces of something that had been forming long before I noticed. The next morning I woke up at exactly 6:30, the same time I had woken up for years, and I followed my routine without changing a single step. I made breakfast, I read the news, I watered the plants by the window. Because there is a kind of strength in routine, a way of reminding yourself that your life is still yours even when something important has shifted beneath the surface. Around 9 o'clock I picked up my phone and opened my banking application again. Not because I expected anything to change but because I wanted to see it clearly, to face it without emotion, and there it was, the same number, 0, clean and final, and I stared at it for a long moment before closing the screen, not with anger. Not even with sadness, but with a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was no longer just about money. Later that afternoon Daniel stopped by, unannounced, which he had not done in years, and he walked in with that same easy smile, the one he used when he was trying to make things feel normal. He hugged me lightly and asked how I was doing, and I told him I was fine, because I was, at least on the outside. He talked about work, about how busy things had been, about opportunities and future plans, and every now and then he would glance at me as if checking for something, a reaction, a question, anything that might tell him I knew more than I was saying, but I gave him nothing. I simply listened, nodding at the right moments, asking simple questions, keeping everything exactly where he expected it to be. And when he mentioned the investment again, casually, as if it were already a success, I smiled and said I trusted him, and I watched the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way his voice grew a little more confident, and in that moment I realized something important. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are safe. When they think no one is looking too closely, and that evening after he left, I sat back down at the kitchen table and opened a small notebook I had not used in years, and I began to write down everything I could remember, every conversation, every date, every detail no matter how small, because if I was going to understand what had happened, I needed to see the full picture, not just the part they wanted me to see, and for the first time since the transfer, I felt a sense of direction, not rushed, not desperate, but steady, like I had stepped onto a path I did not choose but now intended to walk all the way to the end. Over the next few days I paid closer attention than I ever had before, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but in the quiet, careful way you observe something when you already know the answer might change everything. I kept my routine the same. I answered calls when they came. I smiled when Daniel or Emily spoke, but underneath that calm surface I was watching, listening, noticing the small cracks that had always been there but had never mattered until now. On Thursday evening they invited me over for dinner, which in itself was unusual because it had been months since the last time. And when I walked into their house everything looked polished and perfect, the kind of perfection that feels staged if you look at it long enough. Emily greeted me with warmth that felt practiced, her voice just a little too bright, her smile held a second too long, and Daniel hovered nearby, attentive in a way that felt less like care and more like performance. We sat down at the table and the conversation flowed easily at first. They talked about renovations they were planning, upgrades to the kitchen, new furniture, small things that might have sounded ordinary to anyone else but to me carried a different weight now, because I knew what my account looked like, and I knew exactly when those plans had started taking shape. I asked simple questions, nothing direct, nothing that would corner them, just enough to let them talk, and they did, more than I expected, because people often do when they believe they are in control of the story. Daniel mentioned timelines, numbers, projections, all the words he thought would reassure me, and Emily added details, filling in the spaces with confidence, but there were moments when their words did not quite align. When one would say something and the other would adjust it just slightly, small corrections that might have gone unnoticed before but now stood out clearly, like two people trying to remember the same lie from different angles. I nodded. I smiled. I even laughed at the right moments, because I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them certain that nothing had changed. Halfway through dinner Daniel leaned back in his chair and said that the investment was already showing promise, that it was only a matter of time before I would see results, and I looked at him and said I was proud of him, that I trusted his judgment, and I watched as that same subtle shift happened again, the ease returning to his shoulders, the confidence settling into his voice, and in that moment I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not a misunderstanding, this was not a mistake, this was a decision they had both made together, and they were counting on me to remain exactly who I had always been, trusting, patient, unquestioning. After dinner I stayed a little longer, just long enough to let the evening feel complete, and when I finally stood to leave Emily hugged me again, thanking me for believing in them, and I told her of course, because what else would I say? As I drove home that night the streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts settle into place. And by the time I pulled into my driveway I was no longer searching for answers, I was confirming them. I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, opened my notebook, and added a few more lines, the date, the conversation, the inconsistencies, each detail placed carefully on the page, because the truth was no longer something I needed to find, it was something I was already building piece by piece, and I knew that if I kept watching, if I kept waiting, they would show me exactly how far they were willing to go. The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I drove to the bank in person instead of relying on screens and statements, not because I needed confirmation of what I already knew, but because I wanted to see it from the other side, to understand exactly how it had been done. The branch was quiet, the same soft carpet, the same low voices, the same polite smiles that had greeted me for decades, and when I sat across from the young man at the desk I noticed how easily he pulled up my account, how quickly the numbers appeared, and how simple it all looked, just a series of transactions, clean and orderly, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I asked him to walk me through the transfers, slowly, one by one, and he did, pointing to dates, to amounts, to authorization details, and I listened carefully, asking only small questions, never revealing why I was there, because I did not want concern, I wanted clarity, and what I saw was enough. Every dollar had been moved with full authorization, every step technically correct, nothing illegal on the surface, just a sequence of choices made by someone who had been trusted completely. And as I thanked him and walked back to my car, I realized that whatever this was, it had been planned with confidence, not hesitation. They had not acted like people taking a risk, they had acted like people who believed there would be no consequences, that I would accept whatever story they gave me and move on quietly. The drive home felt different that day, not heavy, not confused, but focused. Like the edges of everything had sharpened just enough for me to see clearly. When I got back, I did not sit down right away. I walked through the house slowly, past the living room, past the hallway where framed photos still showed a different version of us, birthdays, holidays, moments when Daniel's smile had been open and unguarded, and I paused for a moment, not out of sadness but out of recognition, understanding that the person in those pictures and the person sitting across from me at dinner were not exactly the same anymore. And maybe they had not been for a long time. Later that afternoon I made a call I had not planned to make until that moment. I reached out to the attorney who had helped my husband organize our estate years ago. His voice was older now but still steady. And when I asked if we could meet, he agreed without hesitation, no questions, just a time and a place. And as I hung up the phone, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not fear, but intention. Because this was no longer about what had been taken, it was about what would happen next. That evening Daniel sent a message asking if everything was still going smoothly, and I replied that it was, that I trusted him completely, and I could almost feel the relief in the silence that followed, the absence of further questions, the assumption that everything remained under control. But as I set my phone down and opened my notebook once again, adding the bank details, the dates, the confirmation of how easily it had all been done, I understood something with quiet certainty. Trust had been the door, and I had opened it myself. But now that I knew exactly how it had been used, I also knew how to close it, and more importantly, how to decide who would ever be allowed to walk through it again. The meeting with the attorney was set for 10 o'clock the next morning, and I arrived 15 minutes early, not because I was anxious but because I have always believed that showing up prepared is its own kind of strength. The office had not changed much over the years, the same polished wood, the same quiet professionalism, the same sense that important decisions were made behind those doors. And when he walked in and greeted me by name, there was a familiarity that felt grounding, like stepping into a space where things were still clear and structured. He asked how I had been and I told him I had been learning something important, which made him pause just long enough to understand that this was not a casual visit. I handed him a copy of my recent account activity along with the notes I had been carefully keeping, and I watched as he read through them slowly, his expression never dramatic, just focused. The way someone looks at a puzzle they already know can be solved. He asked me a few questions, simple ones, about authorization, about conversations, about whether I had signed anything beyond the transfers, and I answered each one calmly, because by now I was not searching for explanations, I was confirming facts. When he finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands, and in that moment the room felt very still, not tense, but precise. He explained that while the transfers themselves were authorized, there were still considerations, patterns, intent, and more importantly, protections that had already been built into my estate years ago, protections I had not thought about in a long time. He reminded me of certain clauses, certain conditions that were designed to ensure that my assets would be handled with care and respect. And as he spoke, I began to see the situation from a different angle, not as something I had lost control of, but as something that had revealed itself too early for them to fully secure. He suggested that I take my time, that I continue observing, that I not confront anyone yet, and I found myself agreeing without hesitation, because that had already been my instinct. When I left his office, I did not feel lighter or heavier. I felt aligned. Like every piece of information I had gathered so far was now part of something structured, something I could act on when the time was right. That afternoon Daniel called again, his voice carrying that same easy confidence, asking if I had heard any updates or if I needed anything. And I told him everything was fine, that I was giving it time, that I believed in the process, and I could hear it in the way he responded, that quiet satisfaction, the certainty that nothing had shifted. But as I ended the call and placed my phone on the table, I realized something that settled firmly in my mind. They believed this story was already written, that the outcome had already been decided, but they had forgotten one very important detail. I had not reached the end of it yet, and for the first time since all of this began, I was not just watching, I was preparing. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside but felt entirely different beneath the surface. I continued my routine: morning coffee, light breakfast, the same walk down the quiet street lined with maple trees that had just begun to turn, everything steady, everything familiar, but now each moment carried a second layer, a quiet awareness that I was no longer simply living my days, I was observing them. Daniel called more often than he used to, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to mention small updates about the so-called investment, always keeping the tone light, always careful not to go into too much detail unless I asked, which I rarely did, and when I did, I kept my questions simple, open-ended, allowing him to fill the space however he chose, because people reveal more in what they volunteer than in what they are forced to explain. Emily, on the other hand, became more present in subtle ways, sending messages, sharing photos of their home, small glimpses of changes that had not been there before, new furniture, fresh paint, things that cost more than they casually suggested, and I noticed how those updates seemed to arrive shortly after our conversations, as if they were reinforcing a narrative, showing progress, showing success, building a picture they wanted me to accept without question, but I did not challenge it. I responded kindly, even warmly, because the more comfortable they felt, the more consistent their story became, and consistency, I had learned, often carries its own kind of weakness. One afternoon I received an email notification from the bank regarding linked accounts and recent activity, something I had overlooked before, and as I opened it and read through the details, I saw connections that had not been obvious at first glance, routing paths, account names, patterns that aligned too closely with the timing of the transfers, and I printed everything, adding it carefully to my folder, not in a rush. Not in anger, just methodically, because by now this was not about reacting, it was about building something complete, something undeniable. Later that week Daniel invited me out for coffee, something he had not done in a long time, and when we sat across from each other in the small cafe downtown, I noticed how easily he slipped into familiar conversation, asking about my health, about the house, about things that felt safe, and I let him. I answered, I smiled, I kept everything calm, and then, almost casually, I mentioned that I might have additional funds coming in from an old account I had nearly forgotten about, and I watched him carefully, the way his eyes sharpened for just a fraction of a second, the way his posture shifted before he caught himself and leaned back again, pretending it was nothing more than polite interest, and that was enough. I did not need more than that. As we finished our coffee and said goodbye, he hugged me a little tighter than usual, as if reaffirming something unspoken, and I returned the gesture without hesitation, because trust, I realized, can be performed just as easily as it can be given. That evening I sat at my kitchen table once again, the same notebook open in front of me, the same pen in my hand, and I added another entry, another date, another observation, and as I looked at the growing collection of notes and documents, I understood that I was no longer waiting for the truth to appear, I was guiding it toward the surface, one careful step at a time.